All right, everybody. Well, welcome back again. Good to see you guys, and good to be with you for another installment of our lecture series on world religions. We've come a long way, obviously, and we're getting really close to the end of our term. What we've been going through for the moment is just our last unit of the course. So after we've reviewed the kind of history, traditions, and beliefs of many of the major world religious traditions, if not, all or the vast majority, we've turned our attention toward some philosophical arguments that have been written in the past, which attempt to make a case that God exists, as well as we'll finally, at the end, next time, talk about objections and criticisms of those same arguments. But I want to start today by, adding the next lesson in our installment. So let me review the philosophical arguments for God's existence that we've come through in the last 3 or 4 meetings. So again, after we analyze the traditions, history, etc., of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Chinese world religious traditions, Japanese religious traditions, we started to go through these new pieces of literature from the past or philosophical readings, which try to make the case that God exists. So one of them was written by Saint Anselm, theologian and scholar from about 1,000 years ago, in his book from 1077 ACE called the Proslogion. He states his argument for God's existence, which has come to be known as the Ontological Argument. So just briefly, I'll review that. That argument says that the definition of God is that God is thought of as the greatest conceivable being. And, basically, after that, he says that if that's the definition of God, greatest conceivable being, greatest thing you could imagine, he says, first off, that's everybody's common idea or understanding of God. Even those that aren't believers would say that's the meaning of the word or concept. So he then follows that by saying that it's greater to exist in the mind and reality than to only exist in the mind. And since God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, that would mean that according to the definition, he should have to exist in both the mind and in reality, because if not, then he would be less than the greatest thing you could conceive of, which would contradict the definition. So, that's his idea. That's the argument. God's defined as the greatest conceivable being. And since it's greater to exist in reality and not just the mind, he exists in both. And he can't even be thought not to exist, is another thing he says, because if he were capable of being thought non-existent, that would make him less great than the greatest conceivable being. So after that, there was Richard Taylor, a second author, who presented actually, it's an ancient argument for God's existence that's been talked about in every different generation, including ours. So the cosmological argument basically says that everything has to have a cause. The author illustrates that with the example of a person finding a sphere in the woods, something odd or unusual, but it would make you question how to get there or what's the cause. So everything has to have a cause. That's the principle of sufficient reason. It's then mentioned that there's different types of truths. Contingent truths are things that depend on something else for the fact that they're true, and they might have been false if a different set of facts had happened. And then necessary truths are things that could not possibly be false. So the contingent truths are things like that you're watching this lecture right now. If that's true, that's nice, but it's something that could have been false if, I don't know, events had happened differently in your day or in your life. You might not have been watching right now. So that's contingent truth. It depends on something. But then a necessary truth is like 1 + 1 = 2, like something that can't possibly be false, like no matter what the circumstances are. So the universe exists. The author thinks it's a contingent fact that it exists. So that means that it might not have happened. He points out the fact that each particular object or event in the universe seems to be contingent. So he reasons that the whole thing is also contingent. Therefore, the principle of sufficient reason says there's got to be a cause for the contingent universe. But whatever this cause is, he argues, can't be something that is itself contingent, and it can't be anything that's a part of the universe, because that's the thing being explained, so it can't be its own cause. The reason that he says it can't be caused by something contingent is because then that would lead to an infinite sequence of causes. That would be an infinite regress, and that would not provide any ultimate explanation or grounds for the whole sequence. So he thinks the only reasonable conclusion to reach is that this universe, which has to have a cause, has to be caused by something that is not contingent, but rather necessary. And that would be like a necessary being like God, something that does not depend on anything for its existence, but on whom or on which all other things depend, including the universe and everything in it. Okay, and so then there was this other argument that we just reviewed from William Paley, a British priest from the late 1700s and early 1800s. So he wrote in the year 1800 this paper, which some call the argument from design, and some academics refer to it as the teleological argument. But the basic gist of this one is that something that is complicated and functional has to have an intelligent designer for it to exist. And, that is then supposed to just lead to this claim that, in nature, there's all kinds of things that have function and complexity, and wouldn't they have to have an intelligent designer just as much as, for example, a watch? So, okay, in the actual argument, it starts with the example of finding a watch in the woods. And the author Paley just says, well, if you did find something like that, a watch specifically, you would know that the watch had to have come from an intelligent creator, because there's no way that some kind of unguided, chaotic, just random process could generate something as complicated and functional as the watch. So it takes intelligence, basically, to create something like that. It takes intent and design. It takes a conscious intention from an intelligent being to make a watch. Why? Because it's so complex, because it tells time, because all the little parts of it have to be just particularly fastened and assembled in a certain way for it to do that. So it's no way that it could have happened through chance or from randomness. And he points out that there's certain things that even if these things occurred to you, these factors would not make you doubt that the watch had to have an intelligent creator. So suppose that you don't know how the watch works, or the watch is broken, or suppose you've never seen a watch being made. None of those things would make you deny or doubt that the watch had to have an intelligent creator. And also, it would not make sense to say, well, something in nature created the watch, because obviously no natural process is ever going to generate a timepiece. It takes, again, intentional actions of an architect, designer, watchmaker for that thing to come into being. So he then concludes, well, there's natural things like, say, the eye, for example, which can see, or the nose, which can smell, or the ears, which can hear. These are body parts, organs, or whatever that are found in nature, but they exhibit even more function and complexity and so on than the watch, which was the other example. So if the watch had to have a watchmaker, by all intuitions, it can't establish itself in any other way, then he thinks that the eye and those things compared by the author to the watch that are natural things would also have to have an intelligent creator or designer. And that must be God, the architect or author of the world and nature. If there wasn't such a being, he doesn't think we could have any viable explanation for how some of the things that we are looking at in nature exist. So it's like an analogy, right? It says that the watch stands to the watchmaker as like the eye stands to God. The relation is the same. You have a very complex and functional thing. Once he establishes this point about the watch needing to have a maker, he thinks that just translates over to these related points about, like, a natural object, say the eye or whatever, having to have a maker. Okay, so then now we're on to one more author about, trying to make a case that God exists. And then next time, we're really going to just kind of focus on a series of objections to all of this that was described by the author Ernest Nagel. But for the time being, we're still going to look at more of the theist arguments. So I want you guys to understand this is the author. His name is Blaise Pascal. Sorry, if I can write, thank you. The man's name is Blaise Pascal. Okay, Blaise Pascal, he lived from 1623 until 1662. And he's a French philosopher, but also he was kind of a polymath in the sense that he was good at other things too. He was also a physicist, a mathematician, and he was interested in religion as well as philosophy. So Blaise Pascal, philosopher, mathematician, physicist, theologian of the 17th century. He lived for not quite 40 years, but he had an impressive body of work, and his output has stood the test of time. So a collection of his writings were put together after his death. The word sometimes to describe after one's death, posthumously. So posthumously in 1669, a book was released of his writings, and from that book we find this argument that has come to be known famously as Pascal's wager. But in our textbook, they just, well, not our textbook, but in the small selection that I mailed to you through PDF, which comes from a different textbook, they just retitled it The Wager. Okay, so this comes from his 1669 book. That again, I mean, it's published 7 years after his death, so friends and colleagues collected these papers so that they could be put forward for publication. And the name of the book was Pensées, which just means thoughts. So 1669, Pascal's posthumously published book Pensées, meaning thoughts in French. And out of that, we are reading specifically one part, the most important probably, his argument, which is called The Wager, or some just call it Pascal's wager. But we'll go with the title of The Wager. Okay, so this is just some basic information to get us started on today's lesson. The name of our author, the date that he lived, the dates, the year and publication title of his major book, and then the article out of it that we are like zeroing in on and doing like tunnel vision focus on, the wager. So The Wager comes from his book Pensées, that's the author, and that's his life. Okay, so let's get into The Wager and try and understand why this man believes that the best thing to do is to believe in God. It's just another way of trying to argue for that proposition. I mean, so we've seen three different approaches to this point. Anselm and his angle, which was basically all focused on the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, and then trying to use that definition itself as, part of a logical argument for God's existence. Then Taylor, who argues about cause and effect and how the universe existing has to have a cause, and that must be something that is not itself caused because it's got to be the first and ultimate being. That would be his argument. And then we saw Paley's argument, which is based on the existence of things within the world that have all this complex design and function. And in his view, if you thought about the fact that a watch could not come about except from the actions of an intelligent human, he believes that the works of nature, which exhibit that complexity, and function, so forth, they have to come from some being that designed them for that purpose. So now it's Pascal and his wager. So let me just try and tell you how he makes his argument. I'll talk you through some of it and see if I need to add some notes at certain points. So one thing that's interesting about Pascal's approach, it's definitely a different approach from the other three authors we just mentioned, from Anselm, Taylor, and Paley, because those three guys all try to make an argument directly that God exists. So in their way of writing out the argument, the objective is to prove that there is God, that there's really a God. Pascal, though, he starts off and right away he says something different than those guys. He says, you know what? I'm not going to try to prove that God exists. He says, I'm not going to even attempt it because, as he states, he does not believe that it's possible. He doesn't think that it's possible to prove or to disprove that God exists, Pascal. That's because he says that even if God does exist, right, according to Pascal, and this will kind of recall some of our earlier lectures on certain perspectives on God, that God is indescribable, that God is ineffable, meaning an unspeakable, infinite being. So there's some qualities of God that go beyond the power of even the human mind to understand. Pascal thinks this. He says, if God exists, he's an infinite being. That means that he's infinitely beyond the powers of the human mind to understand things. So he says, that means, therefore, that it wouldn't even be possible to make a proof of God's existence because it requires us to have insight into things that go beyond the power of the human mind or brain. So as Pascal sees it, it's just kind of like a waste of time to even try to prove that God exists, because he says ultimately God's existence, the existence of an infinite being, is something that a finite mind like ours will never be able to fully even conceptualize, let alone prove. So he says to his reader, I am not going to try and prove whether God exists, because in a way he says it's not possible to do that. And he says that it would actually be foolish to even attempt it because it would presume that you could comprehend the infinite. And he thinks that that's, again, not possible. So first thing he says is, God's existence cannot be proven or disproven, because if God exists, he is beyond the powers of human understanding. And so okay, so what I wrote here is just his thought on this point. What he says is, it's not possible to prove or disprove whether God exists, because if he exists, then he is beyond the powers or limits of human understanding. So, as you can tell then, he's not going to try to, convince you or prove to you something that he thinks can't be proven. And he also says, kind of interestingly, that since God's existence can't be proven in this way, he believes that it's not quite fair, or it's not exactly reasonable when people say to theists, how can you believe in God if you have no proof, or if you don't have an argument to prove that God exists? Because actually, many people who believe in God say that the belief in God is based on faith, not based on some kind of argument that they studied and which convinced them just based on logic. And according to some folks, if you don't have a logical argument for God's existence, then that must mean that your belief is not justified, or it's not worthy of being supported. But this author says that it makes sense in a way for somebody to not have a argument at hand to try and prove that God exists, because if you recognize that that's not even possible to prove, it's almost as though that's a sign of respect for the awe and the majesty of this infinite being. Like, why would you even attempt to prove that God exists if that in a way presumes the ability to understand something that goes beyond your powers or your capabilities? So he says it's actually fully understandable, or it's fully justified, when believers in God don't give any arguments, because it's sort of like they recognize that it would be foolish to even attempt it. Let me then read you some of his words, and we'll see where he goes next. So he says at the very beginning of the selection, if there is a God, he is infinitely beyond our comprehension, since, being indivisible and without limits, he bears no relation to us. We are therefore incapable of knowing either what he is or whether he is. That being so, who would dare to attempt an answer to this question? Certainly not we, who bear no relation to him. Then he goes on, he says, who will then condemn Christians for being unable to give rational grounds for their belief, professing as they do a religion for which they cannot give rational grounds? They declare that it is a folly in expounding it to the world, and then you complain that they do not prove it. If they did prove it, they would not be keeping their word. It is by being without proof that they show that they are not without sense. Okay, so that's his first statement, that no one can prove whether God exists. So he says, I'm not even going to go down that road. I'm not even going to try to prove that God exists, unlike the previous authors who, were making that case, that they had a proof. So what will he say next if he can't prove it or disprove it? What he says next is that, okay, well, even if we cannot prove whether God exists or not, we do know one thing for sure, and that is that either God exists or what? Or he doesn't, obviously. It's got to be one of those two possible cases. Either he exists or he doesn't, because that covers all the possible cases. So that's his next point. He wants to draw our attention to one thing that we do know for certain, which is that even if we can't tell which one it is, whether he exists or not, we know that either he exists or doesn't exist. All right? So the knowledge of that disjunction, of that or statement, that much is a total certainty. So let me write that one out. Okay. Okay, so here's where we're at this stage of the presentation of his argument. He opens up by saying, I cannot prove whether God exists, neither can you, nor can anybody, because to prove or disprove whether an infinite being exists is going beyond the limitations of the human mind. So one thing we can't prove is whether God exists or not. But on the other hand, one thing that is certain, and that we do know for 100% sure, is that either God exists or he does not exist. We can't tell which one it is. We can't prove which one it is, but we know it's got to be one or the other. Now, just a little point about logic and some types of sentences. Some forms of sentence are known as disjunctions. That's just a term in grammar and in logic. A disjunction is an either-or sentence, like either it will rain or it'll be sunny. Either I will ride my bike or I will walk to work. Either I will have pizza or tacos for lunch. Just either-or statements. Those are what those are. They're called disjunctions. And about disjunctions, every disjunction is necessarily true if it disjoins one statement to its negation. So if I basically say either this or not this, that has to be true because it covers both the case in which the fact is the case and in which it's not. So if I told you that either I was born in the 80s or it's not the case that I was born in the 80s, that sentence has to be true, not just of me, but of everybody, because either you were or you weren't. There's no third option, right? Either my phone is on the table or it's not on the table. It can't both be on the table and also not. So every statement and its negation, the disjunction of those two is necessarily true. So what we're saying here is either God exists or he does not. That much we can say is totally certain. We don't know which case of the two that it is, but it has to be that it either exists or doesn't exist. So knowing that much, he says we're kind of now forced to take a choice on which side we're going to wager. We can't have evidence or knowledge of which is true, but he says we're forced to wager on it, kind of like the use of the word wager is to reminisce or call to mind the idea of making a bet or like gambling. So when you wager something, you can wager on, like, say, a coin flip, where you're choosing between heads or tails which side the coin will land. And you don't know in advance which side the coin will land on. If I was to flip a quarter right now, we know that it's going to be either heads or tails, but we're not sure which face is going to show at the end. But we know it has to be one because there's only two sides to that coin, and they can't both land. It's sort of similar to that in the case given here. He says, we don't know whether God exists, and we can't know, and we can't prove or disprove. But we have to choose which side we're going to believe, which side of the coin, as it were, we're going to choose in this wager over the question of God's existence. So will you wager that he exists, or will you wager that he doesn't exist? You're not sure which side to call, perhaps, but you know that one of those two things in the end is true, that either it's true that God exists or it's true that he doesn't. So which one will you bet on? That's his question. It's not a question of proof, he says. It's more just a question of what bet holds the greatest possible reward and the least possible risk. So he's kind of comparing the choice of whether to believe in God or not to the choice of whether to pick heads or tails, for example, in an act of making a bet or wager. The similarities between the coin flip and this decision about whether to believe in God is like so. In both cases, we know that there's two outcomes that could be the result. In the coin flip, it's either heads or tails that could be the result of that coin flip. With God and theism, the outcomes that are possible is that either it's true that there's a God and he does exist, or it's not true and there's no such thing, and we're just talking about a make-believe thing. So it's one of those two, that he either exists or he does not. We are therefore put to position to have to choose which side we want to pick. Now, I know that some of you may be thinking, well, I don't like to bet on things, and if it was me, I would just not bet at all. Now, let me say something, because Pascal actually has some thoughts about that idea. Now, if it's real life and we're just betting on like a coin flip, literally, and you're not the betting type, you just don't like to gamble or take those chances, then if I came up to you and I said, okay, look, I'm going to flip this coin and I want you to bet with me, you're going to call heads or tails, which one you want to call, I'm going to flip it now. If you don't like betting, you could simply say what to me? You could say, sorry, but I don't want to get involved. I don't want to call either side because I'd just rather not make a bet. And if that's how you feel, that's fine. And all I could say is, all right, well then you're not the betting type, so I'm not going to be able to make a bet with you. But hold on. With this question, whether you're going to believe in God existing or not existing, the author says this is actually a forced wager. He says this is a wager basically that you're being forced to take part in, because if you thought that you could avoid taking a position, he argues that that would be judged the same as if you just didn't believe in God at all. So if God does exist, he thinks that he will deny the rewards of being a believer, not just to those that have chosen to say they don't believe in God, but even those that have taken no position on it either way. So he says, if you don't make a bet, as it were, if you choose not to wager, that's kind of equivalent to just choosing or throwing your side to the wager that there is no God, or that you have not wagered that he exists. So, he views it this way, that anything short of affirmative belief in God's existence will be counted as not having the belief in God if and when there's a judgment brought to you by God in supposing that he exists. So he says that's why it's a forced wager, because if you thought you could just not wager, you're like, I'm taking no interest in this question of whether God exists and I'm not going to take a stand. He believes that if you're sitting on the fence, you're still not a believer, and therefore you still have made a wager. Not wagering is like wagering that there's no God. So knowing that, he says, you're kind of put in a position where you're forced to wager on this question. Unlike some bets that we could just walk away from in life, here's one he says that we cannot escape, because even choosing not to partake is still kind of taking a stand in the way that the bet's outcomes would play out. So it's a forced wager then, guys, according to Pascal anyway. And that means the only leftover question is, since you're being forced to take a bet, as it were, on whether to believe or not believe in God, he then just says, well, which bet would hold the most benefit out for you? And which one potentially could hold the most losses? So what's the bet that has the most chance to expose you to the greatest rewards at the least possible risk? And because that's the bet that he thinks would be the most reasonable. Now, if you're making a real life bet on something, obviously, if you were given a chance to take one bet that exposed you to minimal losses but held out the potential of great rewards, and on the other hand, the alternative bet was just the opposite, where it exposed you to the potential of great losses, but there's not much that you could gain, then you'd rather take the bet that poses more possible winnings against less possible loss, because then the risk to reward ratio would be much better for you. You're not risking as much and you have more to gain. So then he just says, let's consider what could possibly be the results if we were to either believe in God or not believe in God under the two possible outcomes, which he's saying we don't know for sure which one it is, but let's just go ahead and try and game out the scenarios, right, about what would be the result should you believe in God or not believe in God, in case he either does or doesn't exist. So this gets us into actually something that in the years and generations and centuries since Pascal's writings, it's been formalized as kind of game theory. And some people even argue that Pascal and the wager is one early example of game theoretic reasoning. In game theory, you try to determine what actions would be rational for a rational agent if they were simply trying to maximize their own perceived self-interest given a spectrum of choices that were available to them. And if we make some prior assumptions like that they're simply trying to maximize utility and that they'll do so based on the information that they have, then it seems like game theory allows us to predict people's choices in a lot of times, or if not their choices, at least what would be rational for them to choose from the standpoint of promoting their own well-being or self-interest. So game theoretic decision-making is sometimes diagrammed visually by what are called Punnett squares. And the Punnett square allows you to combine an outcome with a action or a position that one takes relative to a choice situation. So to sort of show us all here why he thinks that the belief in God is the better of the two wagers, so to speak. I'm going to draw a little Punnett square here, and this will, I think, make pretty vivid and pretty straightforward the reasoning that the author is using to try and, justify his ultimate conclusion that best choice for you is to believe in God. So this is a box, okay? And in the box, you know what? I'm sorry, but I want to make it a little bigger, if I may, just because I'm going to have to put a few points of info within it. So let me make sure it's not too small. Okay, I think that's good enough. Here's our box. Okay, now, before I fill in the box in a way that represents our current topic about question whether God exists and whether you're going to believe or not, I want to sort of just present a different choice situation using the Punnett square, and that'll be a model for us that will then help us understand the ultimate application that it has to our current topic. So we're going to look at a literal heads, tails, coin flip bet for just a minute. In the top two vertical columns, I'm going to label them with the two possible outcomes of the coin flip. So as you all know, what is one possible way that the coin flip could end? It could end with heads being the face that shows. So lands, heads. That's what this column will represent, okay? This other right side column is going to stand for the case where the coin lands with tails, okay? Now here, there's two horizontal rows, okay? Two vertical columns, heads and tails, two horizontal rows right here. And to the left of this box here, I'm going to just draw, or write, I should say, the two possible choices that a bettor can have if they were making a wager on the coin flip. So as you know, there's two possible choices of which face that you can call with respect to the given coin. So one possible choice is you can pick heads. So that's what this top row will show. And then the bottom row is the other alternative where you can pick tails instead of heads. Okay, so now, hopefully you can notice that each of the four boxes within the larger box combine two coordinates. One, a outcome of the coin flip, and one, a betting stance that a bettor took. So we can simply now, by looking at the combinations, chart off which combos represent wins for the bettor and which would represent losses. All right, so suppose the person has picked heads, and heads is the face that lands. Well, that means they won because they picked the side that landed, so that's a win by definition of this bet. Suppose, though, that they pick heads, and tails was the face that showed when the coin landed. In that case, they lost their coin flip bet because, they called heads, coin comes down, lands tails, that's a loss, that's an L. Now, on the other hand, suppose that somebody picks tails, that was their choice about which face would land, but it lands heads. That's another loss because that would, again, be picking the wrong face. And then if you had picked tails and tails was the landing side, then that's another way to win. So the Punnett square is just showing you that when it comes to this two-factor choice situation where there are two betting positions that are open, there's two ways to win and two ways to lose. You can win by picking heads if heads lands, or you can win by picking tails if tails lands, or you can lose if you pick tails and it's heads, or if you pick heads and it mismatches with tails. So before the coin is flipped, we don't know which combo of outcome and betting position there will be. I mean, maybe we know the betting position, but we don't know, of course, whether it'll be a winning or a losing bet. Now, utilizing this same kind of graph and logic, we're going to apply it to a much bigger question than a simple flip of a coin. And we're going to use this to try and explore whether or not, according to Pascal, it would be best for you to believe in God, or for anybody. So as before, we have two possible outcomes of the quote-unquote wager, except they're not heads or tails. They're rather the question whether God actually exists or does not. So one possible case, again, he says we don't know which one it is, but we know that it's one or the other, just like with the coin flip. We don't know which side will land, but we know it's going to be one or the other. Okay, so either God exists, that's one outcome or scenario that could be true. Another one is that God does not exist. Maybe that is the case. Okay, so maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. On the left here, we're going to show the two possible betting positions or choices that you can make with respect to this wager. So it's not picking heads or tails. It's picking whether you think God exists or not, which basically means, do you believe in God or not? Do you believe in the reality that God exists? So one position one can take is believe in God. That's one choice one can take concerning this quote-unquote wager. The other option, of course, is that somebody can choose not to believe in God. So okay, so as before, we see our little matrix of possibilities. In every vector where we combine a horizontal row with a vertical column, we're going to see a combo of betting outcome and betting position. And we can determine in which cases we are getting a win and what is the win, and where we're getting a loss and what is the loss. So say that one believes in God, okay, and it turns out that it's true, that God does exist. Well, of course, if you had believed in God and God exists, I mean, it depends on the tradition that we're speaking of, but keep in mind this is written in, Christian Europe and stuff, so they're thinking of the Abrahamic and Christian interpretation of God, which generally will hold good for the other major monotheistic world religions at least. So, as you know from those traditions, at least Christianity and Islam, which are the two most widespread, if you believe in God and God exists, there's a reward. I mean, compared to the model of picking heads and landing heads, simply spoken, that's a win. You chose the side that turned out to be the case. But what is the win, quote unquote, in case somebody believes in God and that turned out to really be the truth? Well, at least in these traditions that I've kind of highlighted just now, we already know what the answer is. They say that a person who believes in God, if God exists, will go to heaven and be rewarded by God. And so that's a win, but what is the positive benefit of it? It's an infinite benefit. It's supposed to be everlasting, like heavenly paradise, so infinite happy life. So that's a win, and it's such a win that I'm going to put positive to infinity. Okay, that's the infinity symbol, like a figure 8 turned over on its side. If God exists and a person believed in God, then they'd be rewarded with the heavenly afterlife for eternity. So, I mean, it's basically like the biggest jackpot win a person could ever win, bigger than anything else. They say heaven, nothing could be better than it. So it's, again, supposed to be an eternity of happy life. So the big win, believing in God, if he exists. Again, we're not saying we know that, but that's a possible outcome. Suppose, on the other hand, that somebody believes in God, and as it turns out, there is actually no God. So we are not, again, claiming to say this is certain either way. So it's just a 50-50 kind of, according to the way Pascal has presented it. But suppose a person believed and there's no God. Okay, well, then they weren't right. They believed, but it wasn't true. And what we can say is maybe that's like a loss, at least on parallel with the graph that we were looking at before when it was a coin flip. That's picking a side that did not show out. But if it's a loss, the question is, well, what really is the loss, if anything? And you might say nothing really. It just means that there's no God, but you also are not being punished, or you're not like being denied anything. Well, perhaps so. I guess you could say it's no loss at all, or maybe you could say that it's a minor loss of the time and the energy that it took to practice religion in the person's life, which under this supposition would have been unnecessary, or even a use of time and energy that they could have devoted to other things. So it's a loss of a kind. So I'll put minus for negative, but it's not a very big loss. If it's a loss at all, and some say it's not, but if it's a loss at all, you could say it's just some time and energy. Not, the time and energy that you spent practicing religion and maintaining your religious beliefs during your life. Now, some people will say that's no loss because they like the time they spend doing this, or they value the energy that they expend on it, whether or not it was actually true or not. But anyway, you're getting the picture, I hope, that if you believe in God, there's two possibilities. Either you're right or you're wrong. If you're right, you're going to heaven forever, and that's the best thing you could imagine. If you're wrong, well, you're only losing a little bit. It's not that much if you compare the possible loss with the possible win. Now, on the other hand, there's another bet, though, that one could choose to take. Say they don't believe in God, and that was their betting position in the wager. Let's game out the scenarios again. So if they don't believe in God, well, what if God does exist, though? So they chose not to believe, but they were wrong, and really there is a God. Okay, if that is the combination, the author thinks, that's a loss, certainly. It's not picking the thing that ended up to be the outcome. So I'm putting a negative sign. But what is the thing that you lose? Well, okay, so in the Christian and Islamic traditions, for sure, we're saying that the person will be punished perhaps with hell. I mean, there's a doctrine of hell, of course, for the non-believers, both in Christian scriptures and in Islamic scriptures, and there's some descriptions of hell in some Buddhist traditions or sects, and some Hindu traditions or sects talk of the same, even though it's not as dominant in their traditional understanding of the religion. But at any rate, a person that doesn't believe in God, but yet there is a God, is not going to at least go to heaven. So they would either be denied infinite happy rewards of a heavenly afterlife, which is losing something of infinite value, or being denied it, or they're actually going to be punished with an eternity of hell. And I mean, how bad do they say hell is? Well, it's like the opposite of heaven, right? Instead of an eternity of happy afterlife, it's infinite pain, torture, suffering for all eternity. The descriptions of it in these traditions like Christianity and Islam are very vivid, and they're sort of dark, gnashing of teeth and wailing, fire and brimstone, and all this other terrible stuff. So it's a loss to infinity. It's the loss of infinitely happy afterlife or eternal punishment in hell. So if a person doesn't believe in God and they're wrong, they're basically putting a lot at risk, because if they're incorrect, there's a heavy punishment or a big denial of reward. On the other hand, suppose they don't believe in God and they're correct. There is no God. So we can say that's a win. Yeah, they chose the thing that ended up being true. But what is the benefit to the individual in specific if that was the combination? They didn't believe and it turned out there's no God. Well, if there's something they win, it's really not much. It's just some time and energy that they get back, perhaps, that these other folks in that case would have been spending on their religious practices, which this person, I guess, was able to pocket some extra time and energy by not doing those things. Under this scenario, it would have all been for nothing anyway, so they get that time and energy back. But it's not a big reward. You see, it's either nothing at all or a little bit of time as the reward. So now when you see the graph kind of all filled in, this is me kind of using this graph to help illustrate the features of his argument and position here. He says to you, well, now let's evaluate the total risk to reward ratio of the two possible wagers. You're forced to wager, you can't get out of it. If you try not to take a position, then you're basically still not believing in God, and therefore the same possible rewards or benefits or punishments would still apply to you as a non-believer. So he says you're forced to take a wager. Let's just then look at the possibilities for either wager. If you're believing in God, you have a chance to either go to heaven forever and have a perfectly infinite happy afterlife, or maybe just waste a little time during your life if you're wrong. So there's a possibility of a great reward against a minor loss. On the other hand, if you choose the other alternative wager, not believing in God, there's really not much you can gain. Even if you're right, it's like, so what? You're not really getting much if you're right. But if you're wrong in this case, the risks of being wrong are much more intense than the risks of being wrong here, because this could land you either in hell or deprived of the infinite rewards of heaven. So in one case, your bet holds out the potential of a great reward hedged against a small possible stake, like something small is being risked if you lose. On the other hand, you're placing a lot at risk for the sake of a small potential gain, even if you're right. So he says if you're a rationally risk-averse person and you're forced to take one out of two bets, why would you take the bet that exposes you to greater possible losses and less possible gains when you could just as well take the other bet? And even if you're wrong, you're not risking much. But if you're right, you win everything. So it's like if you wager that God exists, then here's the possibilities. If you win, you win everything. If you lose, you really lose nothing. If you choose the other wager, that there's no God, that it's the opposite. That if you win, you kind of win nothing, but if you lose everything. So in his view, the choice is clear. You should just kind of like, as it were, play it safe, believe in God. And in that sense, you kind of become insured against the possibilities of, eternal torment, or at least deprivation of heaven, in case it exists, in case it's real. So he's kind of advising the reader that they ought to believe in God out of perhaps the perception of rational self-interest, that believing in God is the safer bet, as it were, between choosing to believe or not believe, because you'd rather be wrong about believing there's a God than wrong about not believing that there's a God. Do you kind of understand? I hope that makes some sense. So I'll read now some more of his own words, which, I've tried to put a more contemporary spin on it so that it's easier for you to follow. Some of what he's written here, of course, is written in that old 1600s type of language, but we'll get to it. He says here, you must wager. There's no choice. Which will you choose then? Since a choice must be made, let us see which offers you the least interests. Let us weigh up the gain and the loss involved in calling heads that God exists. Let us assume the two cases. Let us assess the two cases. If you win, you win everything. If you lose nothing. Do not hesitate then. Wager that he does exist. Let us see, since there is an equal chance of gain and loss, if you stood to win only 2 lives for 1, you could still wager, but supposing you stood to win 3. Now, going down a bit further, he says, there is an eternity of life and happiness. That being so, even though there were an infinite number of chances, of which only 1 was in your favor, you would still be right to wager 1 in order to win 2. And you would be acting wrongly, being obliged to play, in refusing to stake 1 life against 3 in a game where out of an infinite number of chances there is 1 in your favor, if there were an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won. But here there is an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won. 1 chance of winning against the finite number of chances of losing. And what you are staking is finite. That leaves no choice. Wherever there is infinity, and where there are not infinite chances of losing against that of winning, there's no room for hesitation. You must give everything. And thus, since you are obliged to play, you must be renouncing reason if you hoard your life rather than risk it for an infinite gain, just as likely to occur as a loss that amounts to nothing. So he says you wouldn't be rational if you were trying to safeguard all your time spent in your lifetime, when, on the other hand, if you had just believed in God, a loss would amount to nothing, and you're giving up a chance at an infinite gain if you play this hand in the bet. He says, every gambler takes a certain risk for an uncertain gain, and yet he is taking a certain finite risk for an uncertain finite gain without sinning against reason. Here there is no infinite distance between the certain risk and the uncertain gain. There is indeed an infinite distance between the certainty of winning and the certainty of losing, but the proportion between the uncertainty of winning and the certainty of what is being risked is in proportion to the chances of winning or losing. So he's just getting a little bit mathematical with it. He's saying, if you had an infinite reward held out for you, and all you had to do was put up something finite as the stakes, then you'd be renouncing reason to withhold the finite stakes when there's an infinity of benefit to be derived from playing that risk. So as an example, I don't know if this is a perfect metaphor, but suppose that I bust out a coin and I'm like, okay, let's bet on heads or tails. I'm going to let you choose which side you want to bet on. And by the way, you're like being forced to bet, so you're going to have to take a pick. So suppose I say, all right, if you bet heads, here's the possibilities. If it lands heads, I will give, so you put up the quarter. It's your quarter coming out of your pocket. You're going to flip it. I'll let you call what side. If you call heads and it lands heads, I will give you $1 trillion. Okay, $1 trillion. If it lands tails, though, then you have to give me that quarter. Okay, so that's the bet if you bet heads. You got what I said? You stake the quarter. That's your risk. You're putting the quarter up for risk. If it lands on tails, I'll keep that quarter. If it lands on heads and you've called heads, then I will give you $1 trillion. On the other hand, you can call tails as well. But here's how it will go if it was tails. If you flip the coin and it lands tails, then I owe you 25 cents if you call tails. But if you call tails and it lands heads, then I'm going to torment you and torture you for eternity. Okay, so you've got those two choices about which bet to make, heads or tails. And if you're following the description of the possible outcomes, I'm sure you understand that the better bet is what? Heads. Because if you bet heads, you're only risking a quarter, but if you're right, you're gaining basically infinite wealth. On the other hand, if you bet tails and you win, you're getting a quarter, which is a tiny win. But if you're wrong and it's heads that shows up, then you'll be tortured for eternity. So again, you have two choices about which bet to take. One of them has the big upside against no real downside. If you're picking heads, you have an opportunity to win basically an unlimited amount of money if you're right, and you're risking some very small finite amount if you're wrong. But if you're picking tails on the same coin flip, you're having one chance to win a small amount of money, finite amount. But if you're wrong by having cast that bet, you're going to lose something of infinite value for all eternity as well. So it's a clearer choice then. He thinks that it would be irrational, actually, not to just make the safer bet. As long as you're obliged to take one bet and there's no way to escape the bet itself, why would you take the bet that holds out less opportunity for gain against a greater possibility of loss when you have another option which is equally available to you, which is the exact contrary? It holds out a great potential benefit against no real risks. So he says then, our argument carries infinite weight when the stakes are finite in a game where there are even chances of winning and losing and an infinite prize to be won. So at the very end, he says, he's kind of trying to turn the tables on those that say it's not rational to believe in God because you don't have these great arguments. And he's just abandoning any attempt to even give arguments. He says, never mind doing that because I don't think it would work anyway either way. I'll just tell you that you have to choose whether you believe or not. And here are the real possibilities that one faces if they make either of the two choices. And then he just advises you to choose to believe because it's more rationally risk averse. And, that's sort of him trying to turn the tables on the classical claim that theists are not being rational in what they are believing because they're believing in something based strictly off of faith, or that they don't have good empirical evidence to believe in these things. And he's saying that a rational person tries to maximize their own self-interest and minimize their exposure to risk. So wouldn't it be more rational then, he says, from any evaluation of what's within reason, to just simply believe in God, and in that way you're insulated against the possibilities of divine punishment if such a thing exists. Now, at the end, he says, some people might say, well, how can I choose what to believe? I can't make myself believe in something that I don't believe in. So you're asking me to make a wager, right? Well, in real life, you can pick heads or tails because the choices are clearly available. But you might think this is not the correct analogy because whether to believe in God or not is not something I can simply just direct myself to do by, like picking heads or tails on a coin. My beliefs, you might say, are not, I have no ability to voluntarily choose which beliefs I have. They just happen to me automatically based on my sense of the evidence or whatever. What about that? At the very end of his paper, he says, well, if you find it that you don't have the ability to believe, he judges it that, well, that can't be reason speaking, because reason would tell you that the more rational thing to avoid risk in doing would be to believe. So he says, to get past your skepticism, you should just, at first, go through the motions of practicing religious rituals, saying prayers, attending church services, and things like that. And then after a while, he says, it'll become a second nature for you to start acting like that. You'll instill within yourself certain habits, and then those habits will take over and they will make you a believer, even if you're not a true believer at first. So he says, to those with intellectual barriers that prevent them from belief in God, they should try to weaken those somehow by going through religious practices and going through the motions, as it were, until it becomes a second nature or habit. And then the belief will come to them more easily because they will make their tendencies to doubt and skepticism erode over time. that's why he says here, he imagines his critic saying, "But my hands are tied, my lips are sealed, I am being forced to wager, but I am not free. I am being held fast, and I am so made that I cannot believe. What do you want me to do?" And he replies to that comment by saying, "That is true, but at least get it into your head that if you are not able to believe, it is because of your passions, since reason compels you to believe, and yet you cannot do so. Concentrate then not on convincing yourself by multiplying proofs of God's existence, but by diminishing your passions. You want to find faith, and you do not know the road. You want to be cured of unbelief, and you ask for the remedy. Learn from those who were once bound like you, and who now wager all they have. These are people who know the road you wish to follow, who have been cured of the affliction of which you wish to be cured. Follow the way by which they began. They behave just as if they did believe, taking holy water, having masses said, and so on. That will make you believe quite naturally and will make you more docile. What have you to lose? To show you that this is the way. The fact is that this diminishes the passions, which are your great obstacles." Okay, so there we have Pascal's wager, another very famous and influential theist argument, which tries to establish, if not that proof God exists, at least that with respect to the choice of whether to believe in God, a person would be better off believing because of the possible playing out of benefits and harms according to either alternative way of betting. Now, there are objections to all these arguments, though, that we've now covered, whether it's the ontological, cosmological, teleological, or Pascal's wager. So I'm going to devote the whole next lecture that I post later on, the next couple days, to one final discussion about what are objections and criticisms of these different arguments that some people might raise, and showing why they don't find them to be compelling or convincing. We want to have balance. We want to understand all perspectives. So we've spent, our whole semester learning about different world religious traditions, and we've also had a healthy discussion of different important arguments that try to prove God's existence over the years. We're going to close our last posted lecture just by reviewing some objections to these, to hear what seculars, atheists, and skeptics might say in reply. And then that'll set us up for, our final week of next week, where we will have one review session and of course our final exam. I'll be posting also to each individual student. I'll be sending emails later tonight and the next day to give you your grade and comments on your second essays that you've submitted last week as well. Okay, guys. Well, I really appreciate you being here and tuning in yet again. Thanks for all your attention throughout the whole semester. We're really here at the very last couple stages, so make sure that you stick with it and try not to fade at the end, but just sprint to the finish, to use a running metaphor. Anyways, anybody that needs me for any reason, as always, just contact me. But for now, have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye.